So this is a very fitting panel, I think, to wind down the conference. For 4 days now, we've been talking about various different topics, initiatives, use cases, challenges, and business models surrounding the open networking movement, which is what this conference is really all about. And what we want to do today is think about some of the what lies ahead, and we want to start by addressing where open networking is. We want to summarize a lot of the topics that we opened up on Monday's multiplayer workshop, where we had 7 organizations from the standards community, open source projects, groups that are more industry oriented versus technology oriented, to talk about where those groups stand with regard to SDN and NFE. And what we want to do today is I want to ask a series of questions just to expose some of the areas that we're thinking about moving ahead. So first I want to introduce the panelists. Actually, I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves. Wajong, do you want to start?
Yeah, Hwa-jung Han from Verizon. I'm leading SDN Technology Architecture and Planning Organization.
I'm Dan Pitt from MEF, and I've been working in SDN since the beginning of ONF.
This is Tomin. I'm from Equinix. I head up business development activity for the SDN NFV. Previously, I was with IBM for 17 years, and before that, I was the chief architect for Cable Wireless Optus, which is now Optus, the second largest carrier in Australia.
Hi, I'm Stefan Walraven, co-founder and CEO of Imanta. We are a software product company specialized in end-to-end service orchestration.
All right, so I'm going to start by talking about SDN, and I was quite surprised to see, I think it was today or yesterday or today, a pronouncement by Gartner that SDN is dead. That was sort of interesting. So I'm going to ask our resident SDN expert, Wajong, about what do you think, Wajong? Is SDN dead?
No, SDN is alive. Actually, we've been actually head down working on SDN solution. I think Dan knows about this from the beginning of the SDN technology came along. And actually, it was a very hard, intense work for 3-4 years. I mean, I think 2 years for validating the technology and prototyping, and once you validated, hey, this is the right technology to work on, we just head down, worked on for 3-4 years, and now we are actually deploying SDN network solution. And that really, we see every day that what SDN promised to us, agility, service innovation, operational efficiency, all coming together. And one thing that really I want to emphasize is that once you have right architecture and solution available, the speed of software is like, you cannot even compare with the speed of hardware evolution path. So it's happening to us, actually. So I think it's alive.
So I want to get other panelists' views on this. Anybody have a thought?
So SDN, from Equinix standpoint, we've been using SDN for probably about 4 or 5 years now already. It's out in deployment. And really, I think, in the previous presentation, we've also then enabled NFV as a service as well on top of it. So it's well and alive.
And I want to observe something else, and that is when the context and the topic for today is about open networking. So the latest I understand for open source SDN, or in other words, the Open Daylight Project, and there are many other open source controllers, but the Open Daylight Project has something on the order of 1.2 to 1.5 billion subscribers today. So SDN clearly isn't dead, but I thought it was an interesting news development. So next, way back in 2012 and 13, actually around the time of the initial SDN and NFE World Congress, which I know a few people in this room actually can lay claim to, but I'm not sure how many people were at those early events. I just want to take a minute. I'm trying to find my spot. There were a new set of standards development organizations that emerged, and including the Open Networking Foundation, which actually was set up actually in 2011, and Dan Pitt was the initial executive director. There was the ofNFE ISG, and those projects really kicked off a whole different perspective on how a standards body can engage with the overall community. And as a result, they created the open networking movement the way we know it today. And what we see is that the open networking movement actually spawned the idea of an open platform. And as one of the two operators represented, Tom, what I wanted to ask you is to get your assessment of what happened to open platforms. You know, now that we have the benefit of a number of years that we attempted to create them, but I'm not so sure that they were realized. So, Tom?
So I think openness, it depends on how you interpret openness, right? So openness to me is having the choice to select different functions, to select from different vendors. Each unique vendors have got their own implementation, their own advantages. And I think what's critical to me is rather than focus on openness, focus on something that is real, that really helps you deliver the performance that you need for your workload. To me, that's really, I think, what it is all about, because openness really does not mean anything unless you can deliver real business meaningful value for your company. So, and I think today the choice is pretty clear. I think there are, availabilities out there that you could actually consume. And to me, that's really what openness really brings about.
Yeah, I think it's like openness is like really open, like open. You asked open platform. Actually, we are using Open Daylight solution for our whole entire Verizon network, except for the radio space. We are covering our base control solution using Open Daylight, which is open platform. But you don't necessarily use all the bells and whistles coming with that platform. You need to pick and choose. Actually, you want to simplify as much as you can. We pick only two, actually southbound, protocol. One for NetConf is for the more legacy evolution path, and then for true SDN network for OpenFlow, right? So once you skinny down and then you bring up fundamental infrastructure solution you place in, it works. After that is more about defining that open interface based on the data model you need. When you look at the data models, there are common and standard ones that doesn't make sense to create many variation. For example, device inventory data model, right? Box is box and port is port, interface is you don't need to make any differentiation for that, right? So we need you just implement the common data model for that. But if Verizon happen to have they're using that vendor agnostic solution, that we have some service that differentiating from other provider, or some service that we can add value add services, and we create that data model and share that with the vendor who is interested in participating in those, and we open it up. Actually, literally what I'm doing is that we services and functions and tools that we define these days, we define data model first, and then we publish that data model and APIs to our private GitHub, And if any vendor who is interested in participating or providing any value-add services, what I do is we just point to that APIs and data model GitHub, and hey, you guys go and read and figure it out. If you have a good solution, come back to us. It's very different model in a way that when we are introducing traditionally new solutions or even new devices, right, it takes like 6 to 1 year of proof of concept and testing and validation. But with this model, if vendor has a right solution, that doing supporting the open APIs and data models, it only takes, if you really do it right, we are kind of evaluating in lessons, qualifying the vendor in this way. It only takes like 2 weeks for them to really figure it out and understand our data model, and then additional week is more for a demoing, what they can do. So typically, right vendor solution, it takes no more than 4 weeks for us to, from the release and understanding about APIs and data modeling, come to a proof of concept. And we can, if they prove out that is really valid solution, we can go on integrating the solution. So it's just speed to market and speed to integration is really good. So that's what openness is about.
Okay, well,
let me respond a little. In the first talk of the last session, Donglin Shen made a good point about different meanings of the term open, which we've talked about before. You said somebody can publish their spec or their interface, and it's open, and anybody can build to that. But then there's some downsides, which is that everybody does it, and you don't have interoperability. And if you're an operator, it's great. If you're a vendor, you publish it, and other vendors feel like they need to build to it, and then the original vendor changes it, and suddenly they're out of luck. So we used to talk about degrees of openness being, first of all, published is the first level of openness. The second level is what is published and determined is created not by a single organization, but some element of community. And the third is it's actually open source, so there's code behind it. And that makes sense in some cases, it does not make sense in other cases. But if the goal is interoperability, you often have to do more than just having someone publish it. For example, if I'm a VNF author, I want to write once and have it run in all these environments and all these operator environments. And if I have to customize it, I mean, maybe it only takes me 3 weeks for each, but I'd rather not have to do that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the point about, if there is anything that needs to be common and standardized, then we need to use that model. But something that very specific to, our environment, or someone wanting to differentiate, providing different services, that becomes your own model. So, but either ways, there has to be an openness there. Right?
I think it's also related with accessibility. How easy it is. If something is open, maybe it's still by one person, one company, or others, or a limited set of companies use. But when it's accessible, it means you can easy to use it without a lot of effort to learn it and all things. That's also helpful. You don't need to buy the services of that vendor and all stuff. So if that way, or it can even be automated to integrate with those systems because it's a very well specified API, that's then I think also very useful. There's also a level of openness. So it's not necessarily everything is open, but at least the API could be by one vendor or a few vendors, but it's easy to use and not you don't need the services by those specific vendors, and then you still can decide whether you will want to work further with that vendor or not. So I think that's also an important aspect.
One thing that I wanted to make sure is not necessarily all the industry is ready for standard APIs or common or standard model is available, but we are on the way to get to it. But just because not all the industry or vendors are there, that doesn't mean that we need to stop, making progress. What we are doing is, I'm actually, if vendors are not aligned with, standard models or, then I take that vendor native models, and I wanted to make sure that their solution is model driven, so that actually in turn that they can open it up with open API support. In the interim, if I have different variations of vendor native model that I need to support, then I put the abstraction layer until as a closing the gaps until or the standardized model is available. So what the point that I'm making is that there is a way to make progress. I mean, you have to start working on it, implement it, so that you can actually push the industry forward. And also the more you experience this open API and data modeling experience, you can actually guide and direct to the industry, what is really needed, like common and the standard model is not comprehensively available. It's an opportunity for us to learn and contribute.
It's also hard to standardize everything because there's always something new, and then the market will decide what will be the best solution, and that will become the de facto standard. Before there was Cloud Stack and OpenStack, and in the end the industry chose OpenStack. So that's also that there will be new innovation, and it's never possible to have at a certain moment everything standardized. There will always be new things, and after a while they get standardized or de facto standard. So that's
that's another important aspect of it is using the right tool and right technology is very important. That's why modeling, what kind of model that you use, right? For example, Yang model for the device configuration is very popular. So yes, model can change, but we can very easily adapt to that change because you change the model and you just compile it, and there are so many good Yang compilers and modeling tools available. So that changes like almost real time. You can support it. So picking the right tool and again continuously pushing towards using right technology to move forward is very important.
Yeah, I think we were getting a little off the open platform discussion, but what I want to do is I want to hold that thought, and I want to take a pause and take some a question or two from the audience. I want to make sure that we have that opportunity. So anybody have a question based on what you've heard or what you're thinking about in terms of the open networking movement, how it's progressing, areas for change, areas that you think have gone well? Go ahead. Actually, is there a microphone? Oh.
Thank you. For the Verizon, when you work on your SDN network, for your southbound interface, and do you have multi-vendors or just single vendors?
Oh, many.
Well,
many vendors.
Many vendors, how can you achieve the multi-vendor operation?
Okay, so the vendors who are comply with standard interface like OpenFlow, we use them. Controller, and the vendors have their own native data model and their APIs. What we do is we do abstract and normalize that interface. We take it and normalize it per hour.
So you make it a Verizon standard, internal standard, say, you use OpenFlow, and you have your own version of OpenFlow to define the south.
I don't know what you mean by OpenFlow. My own version of
But
OpenFlow is
OpenFlow. It's kind of the protocols. They have API. It doesn't matter API. It's basically way of communications, right? To exchange information.
Yeah, we control so OpenFlow case is a white box, right? Mm-hmm. So and we do intent and policy based networking. So that resided on top of controller as part of a functional controller function. So we inject those policy and intent to the controller, and controller programs a white box, right? But legacy devices are very much so protocol-driven or configuration-driven control, where we're using netconf for that. but that even NetConf support, the data model is very different. For example, Cisco versus Juniper versus Sienna, right? Those northbound, we have a standardized interface. For example, if we are creating E-line service for EBC creation, like northbound is or standardized using MEF model to, very using the standard model. But the way how they configure to support EBC are very different vendor by vendor. So we normalize that layer. We take or interface with the vendor-specific data model, but still it's open to us. But we normalize it in our controller layer so that it is agnostic to the northbound system. So BSS, OSS system, traditionally, if we have a Cisco vendor, we have to vertically integrate for Cisco solution, Juniper solution, Sienna solution, right? In this case, we integrate once with the northbound system with the very standard, E-line data model APIs. So it's agnostic to northbound system that they are dealing with, different vendor solution.
Yeah. Other questions? Okay, I think we've talked about SDN quite a bit, so now I want to shift to NFE. So Stefan, your company is in the orchestration built on NFE, and you've had to deal, you sort of bump into this issue of operationalizing NFE and how, and trying to tackle some of the challenges that we've been addressing since, I would say, 6-7 years now. So with the benefit of that hindsight, can you comment on the state of NFE and how do you think it's addressed? I'm sort of interested in your perspective as an entrepreneur and somebody who hasn't necessarily started out from the NFE coming up. It's sort of...
So yeah, my background is more indeed in IT software engineering, and we bumped up in telecom. What we notice is like actually what we see with customers and prospects is that NFE is still, there are simple things like just a virtualized firewall and things like that is for us like, oh, it's just booting a VM and configuring it. What's special about it? But then the more complex ones, I don't see them really, not many deployments of that yet, at least with the ones that we work with, because I think that there is still a lot of work done on how to build those VNFs to make them really flexible and scalable in a more cloud-like environment. I think it's still more, the way they are built is more like they have been used before in a more, not this kind of dynamic environment. And I think that the majority of the work still has to be done in the development of the VNFs, on how to build this in a way that it can be used in a cloud environment where there is no certainty, that things can go wrong, and you should be able to cope with that. And I think I think they put still a lot of features in the VNFs to handle every possible risk, while actually if you look at the Googles and the Amazons, they actually don't care if something, a VM or a container disappears. So what? We have enough. So that's I think that is the big difference in how to handle risk is that the big VNFs are more like, okay, we have to handle every possible risk. Should be stable. It may nothing may go wrong, and if something go wrong, we can handle it. While the other way would be like make something lean and flexible solution, and something goes wrong, just boot another one, or we have another one available. Just be prepared for the change. It's another way of how to handle with risk, and you have the two ways. And I think the same thing you see in the organization, like you see the organizations are more used to be stable, don't have too much change, while actually becoming agile, you have to handle this change. So it's the same way on how the software is developed as the organization is still working, I think. That's
okay, we have a few minutes left, actually 6-7 minutes left, and I want to go to another big topic in open networking. Okay, go back in time when we got SDN and NFE launched. in 2012-13 timeframe and even before that. And then we've been, ever since, we've been really striving to try to determine how open source can actually play a role in the open networking movement. There were dozens of projects started. There were many, many companies who invested millions of dollars in actually creating open source. And my question, and actually, Tom, I think I'll ask you to start, is that, you know, when we think about open source, the lower layers seem to be easier because of the complexity level. But when we started to, in 2016-17 timeframe, we started to introduce open source platforms for orchestration and then automation. You know, you think back to that time frame, those platforms were supposed to be the panacea, but in reality, if we look at what operators were doing today, and I don't want to comment on Equinix, you can, it seems like proprietary solutions really predominated. What's your personal view or Equinix view on, you know, what happened to open source platforms, not open platforms, but open source platforms?
I think it's a level of interpretation here, Mark. Openness, I think, lies in terms of there's various different layers of openness, you know, as you build, you know, the complete platform. So I think what's important is making sure that you understand the maturity of the technology as to when you can actually apply it, right? To us, within Equinix, what we saw is that, you know, SDN and NFV has been evolving over time. A lot of people have invested a lot of money, as you said, in terms of building this OpenStack framework, for example. So, you know, we didn't come in until about, you know, in the case of, you know, developing the NFV as a service platform, we really didn't start work until about 3 years ago, right? And only in the last a year and a half, we've been able to onboard essentially right now 7 different VNFs, right, from different vendors. And what we saw, and I think probably similar to the comment that you made, is that, you know, it's important to understand how do you want to standardize upon bringing up these vendors quickly, right? So for us, it was a matter of, for example, you know, assuring that they comply with config.init, right? That you want to be able to onboard the image using QCOW2 format, right? So these are the elements that helps us to onboard very quickly. And it's critical that I think we keep that consistent manner. And then for us, in the case of Equinix, because we're not really a telco, we don't really have to worry about on the BSS OSS side as yet. So our BSS OSS is actually very lean, very small. It's, you know, it's your traditional enterprise, right? Because we don't have the legacy of trying to get up to, you know, 5 nines or 7 nines for that matter. We're not looking to actually, you know, build up to that. I think, you know, to Stefan's comment, you know, we're on the mindset of, you know, in the event one of the VNF fails, we'll spin up another one quickly. So that's more of the mindset that Equinix have come in.
Right. Well, Dan, I know you have a comment on open source, so I'm going to let you weigh in on how, you know, what happened to open source platforms, especially as we move up toward orchestration, automation, and the like.
Well, I maintain that they have served a useful purpose in education about what it means to work on a software project together, have an open source framework of some sort. My view, and I'd love to hear your view and your view and your view, from a commercial standpoint, I see vendors embedding an open source core into their product and building some proprietary support and features around it. And it makes the customer feel good that there's some open source in there, but it's not like it's interchangeable with anybody else. And I think that open source makes sense for components that are too large for one company to build itself, or are just too commodity to have everybody do their own implementation. There's no differentiation needed there. So let's agree on that, and even the same code base, and then let's differentiate around that. I think some of the organizations get a little carried away with creating so many open source projects for every piece of the architecture. It doesn't necessarily make sense. And it certainly doesn't make sense when you start putting intellectual property regulations into the open source code releases. So I'd love to hear from...
I think with open source, it's just at the moment becoming a hype to open source things. Well, if you, they're looking at successful open source projects and say, oh, we want to do the same thing with an open source orchestrator or whatever. But in the end, it's about the community, and there should be a community, and a community is not people being paid by their boss to work on the project and to open source it. It's about people really willing to contribute, they are passionate about it, and most open source projects start from just one guy or a few guys building something, and hey, they meet each other on an event and they start building some, and after a while some other people pick up, and then it becomes a bigger project, and then also companies get involved, but then there was a basis and there is a passion, and after a while maybe some of those people work for companies, but still they work for that company because they are allowed to work on a project, not because they have to work on it. I think the success of an open source project is about the community. You cannot make, our core version of our orchestra is also open source, but there is no community. We are only the only one contributing it. We expect in the future more people will contribute it, but at this moment it's, for me, not a real open source project. It's just we making it available. So I think the key thing for having an open source or solution that will be used by many to have a successful project, it will be the community and not forcing people. You can say a lot of vendors are contributing, but they want to be part of it. It's not really the same, I think. That's well, my honest opinion about it.
I have an opinion on this one. It's an opinion, but as one who came from the open source community, I actually, this disclaimer, worked for the Linux Foundation before. Open source networking didn't quite follow the path you're talking about. I mean, it really was driven by the corporate interest. I mean, there is no project that started, I mean, ONAP, Open Daylight, you name the project, I know of. I mean, I was responsible for some ofNFE. I mean, and just think about the main open source projects that we were addressing in the Linux Foundation, as well as even OpenStack, which is not a Linux Foundation project. You know, these were corporate interests that got together, they had a problem, and typically one company drove it. And that was one of the challenges that the industry had. That was one of the areas I was trying to elicit out from you, you know, this idea of open source platforms where we want to get the community, but, you know, someone has an advantage or a perceived advantage, actually both. And I think that the open source platform, we tried it, we have to rethink how it's going to work, because it really didn't gain the traction for operators as soon as we moved up the stack. The big exception, which is lower level, is Open Daylight, as Wajan pointed out. I mean, it's been the most successful open source networking project. That, again, that's my opinion and perspective on this.
Yeah, I think if you call it success, is because Open Daylight is very modular, and it's just a framework.
Yeah, a framework.
And so you can pick and choose whatever you need, and you know the project itself is supporting that framework. You know, whoever choose to run, you know, that microservice, right? MD cell layer, you know, if someone wants to use just the infrastructure layer, you pick and choose with, you know, whatever
and the device models.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what.
So, like, up to the chain as well, I think the reason that it's struggling is it's not modular enough so that you can, you know, plug in stuff, right? And
yeah,
you know,
no,
open source by nature, you know, community has to contribute, right? So it's never going to work if like one company drives everything or one company is dominating stuff.
And it should remain simple to use.
Yeah, but I think...
Yeah, and that's with the modular, I think, linked with that, because if it's really a lot of complexity, then with open source, then you want to support, and then you go to a vendor, and then in the end...
Yeah, I mean, I think we do actually, even Open Daylight, we, for carrier perspective, because of the scale and because you have to deal with so many different groups like engineering, operation, and whatnot. So we are using vendor for support. If something goes wrong, and if we need to do a bug fix and add features, somebody needs to upstream the solution. If you want to continuously using it, not necessarily we all have resources, or everybody can participate though. So that support we use vendor, which works out well for us. And I think one other thing that I wanted to point out, that you continuously going back to open source platform, right? Platform is, you have to have a small building block comes together, and that building block is standardized and open source supported, so that a lot of people using it, it becomes a common tool that is easy to manage and building that platform solution, right? So what we are doing is, I'm starting with open source tools as much as we can. Actually, right now what we are doing is like almost 40% of our solution, we are using open source tools. That tool is not fancy, but like Kafka and Elasticsearch, or you name it, right? So you start from those, so that the more you use those tools, that can be a building block, and people building a platform can put those building blocks together and make that working. So
Yeah, we're going to have to wind. I mean, this is a great discussion. I let the session run over a few minutes because we started late, and I'm going to thank everyone for joining us on this session. I also want to thank everyone on behalf of Layer 123 for joining us for the 2019 SDN and NFE World Congress. We hope you can make it next year. It's going to be in October. I don't recall the dates off the top of my head, but you'll see them on the website and the like. And wishing everyone safe journeys home, and we hope to see you next year. And I want to thank the panelists once again.